offers. So now I'm getting louder by the second. So that said, we need your help to continue to offering outstanding authors for AViD, free programs, the latest technology to our patrons and other new initiatives. Please help us continue to make a difference with a donation to the Library Foundation. There is conveniently out in the lobby Library Foundation table with envelopes if you'd like to make a donation to the library tonight. It is being staffed by the next chapter, which is our young professional group. And if you love the library and you want to get involved, please stop out there and chat with them at the table. I wanted to say a special note tonight. I don't know how many of you have heard, but the director of the Library Foundation, Dory Briles, will be retiring at the end of July. That's how we all felt when we found this out. Dory's been with the foundation, is it 10 years? 10 years. And I would say that Dory has worked tirelessly, but I don't think that's right. I think she has gotten tired on many occasions. There is no bigger proponent of what libraries can do for communities than Dory. And we thank Dory, thank you for your service. You will be missed, Dory, for sure. We will soldier on without you, but it won't be easy. Thank you for everything you've done. A couple of details about tonight. We want your feedback to keep making these events even better. There's an evaluation form that's in your program that you could fill out for us. Turn it in at the information table, and you'll get a chance to win a copy of Brad Meltzer's book, The Lightning Rod. Your evaluations will help us secure future funding to do more of these events. You can buy each of the authors' books tonight. You can get an autograph from them, and you can support a local bookstore. All the books are being sold over here at this table by Beaverdale Books, and 10% of all sales will go to the Library Foundation. I'm going to thank some of the sponsors who have helped make AViD possible. The Nationwide Foundation, Brad and Kelly Edmister, Karen Schaff and Steve Jane, Pamela Bass Bookie and Harry Bookie, Humanities Iowa, a state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation, Dr. Catherine and Andrew Hauser, Douglas and Deborah West, Shelley and Martin Brody, Mary Ritchie, the O'Brien Fitzpatrick Foundation, Dawn Taylor, and Judy Blank. Let's say thank you to all of our sponsors. Now on to our program. Our moderator this evening is Kyle Munson, who many of you know. He is a lifelong storyteller, journalist, writer, and content creator. He is currently a senior content strategist for Principal, and he also chairs the board of the nonprofit Western Iowa Journalism Foundation. He spent 24 years as a journalist with the Des Moines Register in a variety of roles, from music critic to digital editor to Iowa columnist. He's a native Iowan who has traveled to all 99 counties, and he has studied in London and reported from China. Kyle, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Trevor. Well, this is a wonderful turnout. Thanks to everybody for supporting this great series. And I'm just honored to be on stage with these gentlemen tonight. So here's how the evening is going to go. We are going to have a great conversation, somewhat free-flowing, guided conversation with the three authors tonight. And then later on, we'll open it up to audience questions. So you can fill out your question forms and hold it up, and then one of the library staff will come to grab it for when we start the Q&A. And they'll be collecting those throughout the evening, and so we'll have your questions to be able to ask later on in this conversation. As Trevor said, please, they're going to be around to sign books, so get some books from Beaverdale Books if you haven't already purchased these titles. Now on to introducing the three authors tonight. First, we have Dr. Richard Deming. He is medical director of Mercy One Richard Deming Cancer Center. He's revered for the compassionate care he provides cancer patients and their families. His 2020 book, Above and Beyond Cancer, is about the philosophical journeys of ordinary people, the caregivers, patients, survivors, and their loved ones whose lives have been touched by cancer. We also have Neil Hamilton, emeritus professor and the former director of the Agricultural Law Center at Drake University here in Des Moines. He's retired from full-time teaching since 2019 after 38 years focusing on agriculture and food law. His new book, The Land Remains, blends personal memoir, history of Iowa and conservation, and an analysis of contemporary issues of soil health, water quality, public lands, and future challenges to tell the story of how land shapes our lives. And Jim Autry. Jim Autry is an author, poet, business coach, and former Fortune 500 executive. He's authored 15 books, Jim, including the 2020 nonfiction book, The White Man Who Stayed, a biography remembered. This book tells the story of his cousin and personal hero, Douglas Autry, who returned to his native Mississippi after World War II to serve in education at a time when the schools were being integrated. Jim's previous works include books on servant leadership, gratitude, business, and poetry. Let's welcome all three of these authors to the stage. Well, I was trying to come up with some kind of a joke to start this all tonight, like, you know, a doctor and a lawyer and a businessman walk into a library, but I couldn't come up with any good way to finish it. But you are, for a series called, Authors Visiting in Des Moines, you've been visiting for quite some time, obviously, but you also know each other very well. You share a book club, right? Can you just talk about that for a minute? Just your association as friends and fellow writers? This kind of camaraderie you have?
Well, the three of us are in a book club, an 8-member book club. And in fact, Harry Bookie in the front row is, it's affectionately referred to as Harry's book club because he started it 23 years ago. And Jeff is also here, Bob Riley, and gosh, I hope I'm not missing anybody else, but it's a wonderful group. And, we meet irregularly, but somewhat regularly. And person chooses the book and provides a dinner, and we have a wonderful discussion of Iowa politics, and then talk about the book. And the great thing, is, of course, it makes it encourages you to read books that you otherwise would typically.
Yeah, I'll have to ask you for book recommendations later on, as as if this was a book club meeting. But
okay, we just finished Dick's book.
Yeah. So the last book we read was Empire of Pain, about the Sackler dynasty. And so that was a really good book that generated a lot of discussion. And as Neil said, we've also had the opportunity to review Neil's book and also Jim's book at our book club. So we do a little nepotism, and but it's been great. And it's the first book club I've ever belonged to. And I never thought I had time to read books, and I certainly wouldn't have read them if it hadn't been for the book club.
Same with me. I'm reading books with this book club that I would never have read. A couple of them I would never wanted to read. But I've learned a lot from it.
Well, let's talk about all of your books now. I think this is a great trio to talk about in a single conversation. It's such a balance of settings, but also I think, some common DNA and how these came together, at least from my reader perspective, from the perspective of readers. So, you're addressing medicine, the law, and executive action or executive power in some ways. You're addressing our bodies and our health, the land and our environment, education and race. But all of these, as I read them, they all seem to come from such a personal place, whether it's motivated in part by your own parents, or this childhood farm, or your family in the South. Maybe just if any of you would talk about how maybe versus some other book, it felt like these there was a very personal impetus to write this. And maybe that was in the air in these recent years too, for a lot of people.
Well, in my case, the book is it's a biography remembered about.
Get you a better mic there, Jim. Yeah.
They gave me the real mic. In my case, it's about my first cousin, my late first cousin, Douglas Autry. And it's not fiction. It's a remembrance. It's a biography, actually. And it did come from a very personal place, and a story I wanted to write for a long time, and finally got around to it. And then when I got around to it, it took 20 more years to get it published. So it ain't a new book.
Yeah, and maybe just set the table for people. And what should people expect when they come to read this book? About, as you said, a biography remembered, not just a biography. What should they expect when they open it up?
Well, they should expect to read a lot about white supremacy in the South, as well as one man's struggle against that. It's really a heroic story. And I think people will learn a lot about what went on down there. As a matter of fact, Bill Moyers wrote the introduction to it. And if you don't read anything but the introduction, you will learn a lot. He gives the whole thing a lot of the historical perspective and the context for the rest of the story. I think that people who think they know that story will be informed.
Yeah. So obviously, your book is infused with ethics, racial justice, coming from a very personal place and from this childhood setting and from your family. That makes me think you have it's a strong ethical strain in your book too, Neil, coming from the land, coming from your childhood land, right? In fact, you give 40 acres on your childhood farm a literal voice in the book. It becomes a character. Just talk about the motivation behind that.
Part of the book is narrated by the back 40, which was a classic back 40. It was a 40 off a quarter section. And I use it as a way to tell the land story with a much longer lens and a historical perspective. And but also it tries to develop one of the themes of the book, which is that, as Leopold says, when we talk about the land, we're typically talking about the people on the land and not the land itself. But if we stopped and listened to the land and thought more about it, that there's probably a lot that we could learn from it. And so giving the land an opportunity to share its perspective of what happened to it, how it sees its future, how it sees what happened in the neighborhood is really part of the motivation. And it was comforting when the book club read the book last summer, because I was worried that it might seem too gimmicky, to have created this voice of the land, but it's something that many people have, it's resonated with them. So I'm happy to be able to do that. And it gives me a good way to transfer my thoughts into somebody else and let them step on their toes. But
well, in terms of what the land thinks of its future, your book is titled "The Land Remains," which it's one of those titles that you leave it to the reader, I guess, to figure out if the glass is half full or empty, right?
well, and certainly, as I say, we all want to live forever, but newsflash, none of us are going to. And but the land's going to be here, right? I mean, it's going to remain. It was here long before we came, and it'll be here afterwards. And in many ways, how we leave it is really the portrait of ourselves and of our stewardship. And so having that longer term perspective and that resilience that you find in the land, the land will heal itself. And, people love to talk about how we need to save the earth. Well, we may need to save ourselves. The earth's fine, right? It'll take care of itself, but we're the ones that may be in trouble. And so that's certainly part of the idea.
In terms of landscapes, Dick, your book was inspired by these trips you took with patients. Well, even before, I guess, just your own trips initially, right? To these distant lands and these distant peaks and mountains, right?
Yeah, I would say that's not really the impetus for the book. I see it more as, but you're right, the commonality. Can I trade microphones? The commonality of the three books is they're really all memoirs in a sense. I've written a lot of term papers and research papers, but this book, like Jim and Neil's book, really stems from our own journey through life. And it was in the act of writing this book and in sort of the introduction to the book that I finally truly acknowledged for the first time that my career in medicine, my ministry in healing, probably did stem from my childhood days of my mom being diagnosed with incurable cancer and dying of cancer when I was a second-year medical student. And up until kind of putting this version of story to paper, I would give 5 different other versions of why I became a cancer doctor. But in the act of sitting down and reflecting, which is a good thing for a human being to do, it's hard to look back on 42 years of being a doctor without feeling my mom's invisible hand kind of helping me at every fork in the road that got me to being a cancer doctor. And then, of course, the book is about thousands of patients that have taught me lessons, including that none of us are going to be here and get out of it alive. The land may survive, but we're not going to. But how that can still inspire us to actually lead a better life. So I thought I was creating just a philosophical book through stories that I was honored to be witness to about the philosophical perspective of journey through cancer. But by the time the Drake undergrad students got done with the publishing, it shows so many beautiful photographs from Dylan Huey, who is the photographer, whose photography increases the book that it overwhelms appropriately the writing. And it comes out looking more like a coffee table photography book than a book of philosophy. But it's really steeped in the stories of my intersection with my patients' lives and what they've taught me about what it means to be alive.
I'm glad you mentioned that ministry of healing. There was a quote that I really loved. It said, you wrote, "In medical school, I learned a lot about the science and treatment of disease, but no one ever taught us about the host of social, psychological, economic, and cultural factors that can affect our patients' medical care at every turn." So it's really a manifesto about what you came to call this ministry of healing and a new approach to holistic healthcare.
It is, and I would say humanistic. I think that a doctor caring for a patient is a human being caring for another human being, and the humanity that is essential to doing that well. I know that sitting and being present as a good listener in a room with a patient has power to heal. Not everyone with cancer can be cured, but everyone with cancer has the power to be healed. And the act of being in the room, human being to human being, is part of that healing process.
Jim, Dick was just talking about the inspiration coming from his own parents and family, and I wonder what it was like for you to delve into this story, so invested in your own family, because you have different members who are on different sides of these issues and justice down in Mississippi and in the South, and just what you learned from the experience of finally publishing this story and confronting it again.
Let me give a little context for that. There were 5 children in my father's family. There were 3 boys: Ewart, my dad; Eland, his brother; and Everson, his younger brother. And then the sisters, Rufus and Valina. Do not ask me where those names came from. My mother always said they came from the Bible, and I wouldn't go that much into the Bible to try to find them. But Everson was the youngest. My father was a minister, Southern Baptist minister, as was his father. So you could see what handicap I had to grow up with. And then his brother Eland was a farmer, basically, but also was in the legislature. Everson, the youngest, was sort of a ne'er-do-well, alcoholic, but he served in the Air Force, Air Corps in World War II, and came back. I don't know why he came back angry, but he came out back very angry. He was an uncle. Rufus and Valina were sort of side players in this. They were the caretakers of Everson, the youngest son. Now, the reason I go into all that is because Douglas, the main character of the book, Douglas, he was a veteran of World War II, saw a lot of combat, came back, went to college, the only person at that time to get a college degree, and started teaching school, and then went back to Mississippi and ran for superintendent of education, was elected. He then did really naive things, that people take advantage of him, et cetera, and ended up in trouble. In fact, in prison, Mississippi's infamous Parchman Farm. When he got out of there, then he put his life together again. And he was always at heart not a white supremacist. He was just sort of an easygoing guy, and he had a lot of friends of both races down there. But when he got out of prison and came back and began to work, because he saw the impact of education, or the lack of it, on the African American community. So he worked for the federal government in a program that called the Neighborhood Youth Corps, and I won't go into that, but he worked in the Black community to get those kids employed and back in the workplace, and he became a hero in that community. And the result of that was that he was run off the road and had crosses burned in his yard by the Ku Klux Klan. Now, who was the head of the Ku Klux Klan? Uncle Everson. Faulkner wasn't making anything up, folks. I mean, it's all convoluted and crazy, and I won't say any more about it, but in the midst of all that, he emerged as a great hero, and in my view, one of the great unsung heroes of that part of the country. And if you read the introduction by Bill Moyers, he goes into that in some detail too. I'm going to turn it back to these gentlemen. I already feel outclassed.
No, not at all. I mean, just such deeply personal stories. And Neil, let me pull a quote from your book, because you mentioned about stepping on toes, and you want to have somebody speak for the land. And there's one piece that I remember here: the failure to consider the moral dimension of land ownership helps explain a great deal about the tensions in our policy debates over issues like duties of stewardship, water quality, or public lands. If never asked to think differently about how to treat the land, why would you embrace ideas of stewardship and conservation? There's a real sense, I mean, on one hand, you're a farmer and part of this large community, this giant agricultural community in the state, but in some ways, this book makes plain you feel a little bit like a voice in the wilderness advocating for the environment and the land and some of these issues.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. And, I attribute it to several things. And as the book describes, I studied forestry at Iowa State, which was part of the agricultural college, but in many ways quite divorced from agronomy and kind of annual crop production. Instead, in forestry, we took a long-term planning horizon, multiple uses, and we read Leopold, right? And we read essentially the beginning of environmental ethics, and which, at least at that time, and I think still perhaps today, is agricultural colleges are largely devoid of. And as a result, the continuing debates and problems that we've had, and we've had them since the 30s when we started thinking about soil conservation, and we have them outside the window today, in large part grows from the fact that most landowners and most farmers have never had to think about the responsibility to the land, right, and to the concepts of stewardship. And we give a lot of homilies to it, and maybe one step forward on the front 40 and two steps backwards on the back 40, and we suffer and pay the consequences. And part of the book, of course, has a historical sweep, and Iowa has such a rich legacy of conservation heroes, from Leopold and Wallace and Ding Darling and John Lacey, perhaps one of the most under-recognized. And so we have this rich legacy of conservation stewardship, but we've lost a lot of it, right? And what we tolerate today in terms of water quality and soil degradation, I think would shock our forebears. And we're happy. We keep our foot on the gas of all-out crop production. We tap the brakes periodically. But if it was a choice between production or conservation, production will win every time, hands down. And we've seen that in recent weeks, right? Letting people pull land out of the CRP a year early under the idea that we're somehow going to, plant enough crops in the middle of August that it's going to somehow affect the world food supply. You know, whose head's using who, but
you mentioned all these strong voices that are threaded and inspirations that are threaded through your book. Ding Darling, who obviously left his mark on Iowa in journalism. There's a lake in Southeast Iowa. Anybody who's been to Sanibel Island in Florida knows the Ding Darling Preserve there. For somebody that reads your book, they're going to come away with, I don't know, 50 or more other books that they want to read, I think, because you do such a good job of paying homage to kind of the people that gave you some of the inspiration for your career in law and the land.
It's one of my goals. There's probably 50 or 60 different books that are cited, and they're books that I read and somehow integrated into the work, and books that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about using. And I think of Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again, about James Baldwin, and in the chapter in which I talk about race and discrimination and, our, kind of rich history of racism in the nation, much of it tied to the land, and making the parallel between what Baldwin was writing about trying to confront kind of the big lie, and which is that white Americans will never appreciate that they aren't the first in the class, and the lie in agriculture, which in many ways may be that we really care for the land, where our actions don't necessarily bear that out.
Dick, turning back to your book for a minute, something else that really stuck with me there. You have, it's, as I was saying with Neil's book, threaded with the voices of a lot of his inspirations. You have all these voices of patients and the people that have traveled with, alongside you on these journeys. I mean, there's one patient who writes about after his diagnosis, he wasn't able to look himself in the eye in the mirror for months. And it's hard for me to imagine. I just mean that just really in an everyday sort of image gets at how profound that moment of diagnosis is, right? There's another one who talks about, facing and fearing chemo. And so she, writes to you and she says that you told her this: well, you've got three options. One is you do it. The next option is to find an alternative, or the last one is you don't do it. And I read that, and at first it felt like it was almost off brand for your nature of holistic healing. But then when I stopped and considered it, it felt to me like what you were doing was showing the patient like what power they still had over their lives. Yeah, which comes throughout the book.
Yeah, so that doesn't sound like.
And I could be totally wrong.
No. You're right. That doesn't sound like my voice, and I probably used more words than that. But that was the meaning, because I probably 10 times a day say, "You're the boss. I work for you. My job is to inform you to the best I can of your condition, to talk about the options and the risks and benefits, and then help you make the decision that's right for you." And sometimes that decision is to do active surveillance instead of treatment. Or if you're someone who is living with incurable cancer, there comes a time where fifth-line chemotherapy is almost certainly going to cause more harm than benefit. And the idea that you can do nothing, and I would say, again, I think she's paraphrasing, because I never say there's nothing we can do for you. I would say we don't have to do something to try to kill the cancer cells. You will always be my patient, and we will do whatever you need to make sure your quality of life is as good as possible. But that doesn't mean we have to give you something to kill cancer cells. We're taking care of you. But you're right. 10 times a day, you're the boss. I work for you. Let's figure out what you want to do.
And how did putting these stories into a book and going through the process of creating the book, you talked about your personal family history, but how did this change how you look at your interaction with patients, or how you process the grief, or just the accumulated, this is not easy work, but it's very fulfilling spiritual work. How did it change the way you look at that?
Well, a couple of questions. I mean, one, putting how did the stories of my patients and their voice come in? This was the whole book was a collaborative writing with Drake University, and so from the very beginning, the book. I've always wanted to write a book. If it hadn't been for Drake Community Press and this collaborative writing where semester book is done, it would still be in a pile of rewrites. So that's how it came together as a collaborative writing. Your question that I'm sort of hearing is, how do you deal with losing so many people that you care deeply about? And that also is the human condition, that the more deeply we care about someone, the more we will miss them when they're gone. But the alternative isn't to close yourself off, even as a physician, to close yourself off to emotions, I think will lead to more burnout than to open yourself up to the amazing interactions and relationships that are healing. And yes, you are touched by the loss, but you are also inspired by what you have learned, and in helping their family members grieve effectively, knowing how much you cared for them. Ultimately, it's a net positive.
That's wonderful. Through my involvement in the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation, and just from my life, I care deeply about local publishing and independent voices. And you mentioned your work with Drake Press, and the other two of you published with Ice Cube. Talk about a little bit about the importance of local publishing and working through local publishing. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I had never heard of Ice Cube Press until I began to look around for a publisher, and then found this wonderful book of farm women, a photo book that Ice Cube Press had done. And I thought, that's a really high quality little press. And I got in touch with Steve, who runs it, owns it. And that's how I got involved with it. I've always been drawn to trying to work with smaller outfits, whether they're bookstores or, in this case, publishers, instead of the gigantic things, for several reasons. One is, if you're working with an independent publisher like Ice Cube, you get a good deal more leeway. They pay more attention to your opinion, and it becomes much more collaborative effort than just me writing something and then saying, no, there's no good, send it back, and then back and forth. So I think the advantage, it's not only the advantage of working with someone, that's the advantage of having that other voice, that's being able to depend on another source of expertise. And that helps a lot. Also, I just would rather work with a small outfit than a large outfit. And I don't know what to say other than that. I never buy books from Amazon. I buy from Beaverdale. It's not just because I'm supporting the local. It's because I know those people, and I'd rather do business with them than some nameless, faceless entity off somewhere. So my experience with them has been very, very good, and I would recommend trying to work with a small press and realizing that you get more voice. Now, you have to be very choosy about that, because you have to find a press that publishes what you write. And that's not always easy to do. I could answer questions, but I don't think I can go any further here with this.
No, that's great. I mean, and Neil, I suppose farm to table, farm to page.
Well, I in part went to Ice Cube because Jim had contact with him. And so I reached out to Steve, and I hadn't had the best experience trying to publish books with larger publishers, but I had a wonderful relationship with Steve and Du, and he appreciated the book from when I sent him the first draft, and then it became a collaborative process, and the design and the photos and working through it. It's just, I can't say enough. And he's been in business for 30 some years and has published dozens and dozens of wonderful books with a Midwestern focus. But it was very satisfying. In fact, I'm working on a second book. I hope to publish through him as well.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So let me throw this one out there for any of you to answer. I'd be interested in something that any of you have learned from the others about writing, or just something that, you in the same book club, you read together, you debate stories together, you joke with each other. But I wonder if there's something that you've seen in, observed, or learned from each other's writing. Anything's fair game. Don't hold back.
So let me start with Jim. So Jim is just incredibly wise and not a wise guy, but is gentle, but very, very intelligent, and is sort of, you don't have to scream what you believe to get your ideas across. And so we might, in our book club, everybody's talking, and then we'll kind of turn to Jim to get the real scoop on, what's going on. But the book that he's talking about tonight is just such a beautiful story, and just so appropriate for the time. And I think, with what we've gone through the last 2 years in Black Lives Matter, it made it so more relevant than probably when you submitted it for publishing, 20 years ago. And it's so timely. With Neil, so Neil and I are the same age, graduated from high school the same year. I grew up in small town South Dakota, didn't live on a farm, but with a town of 500 people, and my dad worked for grain elevator, so we're involved with agriculture. So reading Neil's book, it was like bringing back some of my childhood, but also the analytical lawyerly. So I always thought I wanted to be a lawyer because I loved to debate in high school, but I didn't like the subjectivity of the social sciences. And so I kind of thought, well, if I could just go to medical school, but then practice law, that would be. But Neil's writing is very, a part of, as you pointed out, he's got like all the references. So his combination of this memoir, but it's also like a term paper. And so in all the best ways, writing.
I didn't see that blurb on the cover, but that was.
So that's my take on my friends.
That was a compliment, though. Yeah.
Jim's book and Dick's book as well, the idea of using stories. And I think that was probably certainly part of the inducement. There are a number of family stories and personal stories and stories of back 40 tales in The Land Remains that, and one of the stories, as long as I'm holding this microphone, I don't know whether Dory's still in the room, but I want to give her a shout out if she isn't. Holler in here if she's standing somewhere in the back. Maybe an unknown thing about Dory, or at least I don't know, but she's from Adams County, and that's where I'm from, and that's where, in fact, the back 40 takes place. And we're the most sparsely populated county in the state. We have another proud resident, Kay Riley, grew up in Prescott in Adams County. I like to think that we hit above our average, typical, but in thinking about it, I think it's also, we're roughly of the same vintage. And in many ways, we're products of when Iowa was proud of its public education system and held our commitment to funding public education in high esteem as opposed to turning it into a political divider, unfortunately, as we have in recent years. And, you know, there's an educational connection to the land as well. And one of the historical lessons, you know, there's a provision in the Northwest Ordinance and that was carried out as we distributed land under the U.S. Land Survey called the 16th Section Law. And the proceeds of the 16th section in every township were dedicated for public education. And so that's in part how we had country schools, was that funding that came from the actual sale of the land when the federal government was selling it was allocated to education. And I actually went to a one-room country schoolhouse, right? The last year we had them in Adams County. But that was, you know, part of the nation's commitment to education and using the land as we used it in any number of ways to build railroads, to have land grant colleges, to do lots of things to reward, you know, veterans. Iowa wasn't heavily a homestead state. Some people think that it might be, but only in far northwest Iowa and Lyon, Plymouth County was there still land to be homesteaded, because by the time of the Homestead Act, all of Iowa had pretty much been allocated and taken up. But I believe that almost a third of it was allocated in grants to veterans from the Revolution, the British American War, right, to the Civil War.
So even in South Dakota, we took the Iowa test of basic skills. Kyle, you were talking about local publishers. I want to give a shout out because my publisher is actually here. So Carol Spalding Cruz is the head of Drake Community Press. And my book would not exist if it weren't for Carol, because my process was a bit different. It wasn't that I wrote a book and sought a publisher. The Drake Community Press does collaborative writing and actually seeks out an organization to collaborate with for 2 years. So there were 9 college classes that were taught around oncology from the science point of view, the philosophy of hope, the burden of the administrative aspect of insurance, 9 different courses, but part of it was this collaborative writing where Carol and Drake students edited my writing. Other Drake students interviewed my patients and edited their essays, and another group of Drake students chose some of the beautiful photographs that Dylan had taken of our trips that matched the theme of each chapter. And then what made the book look so visually beautiful, because I am going to say my book is visually more beautiful than my friends' books. But part of that
compliments
is because of the undergrad publishing class at Drake. They had their whole semester was to choose the size, the format, the pictures and everything. And so this idea of we had to have the book to that class or they were all going to get Fs. Could you imagine how I would never be able to sleep if I was responsible for a whole class? Anyway,
Yeah.
Shout out to Drake Community Press.
Yeah, here. Well, first of all, as the son of a
Excuse
public
me, I
school-
just want to say
Oh,
this.
Go ahead, Jim.
I just want to say that some of us didn't have whole classes of people working on our book.
Unpaid labor too.
I knew this would be a book club meeting. This is great. So first I'll say, as the son of a public school teacher, the talk about education definitely speaks to me. So I appreciate that. So we're going to turn to audience questions here in just a second, I think. But first, as we make that transition, I know that it would be great to have each of you maybe recommend just another book, any book. This is an avid crowd, a reading crowd. You mentioned in your book, Neil, that you always have given out copies of The Grapes of Wrath, right? So I assume that might be your recommendation. If somebody for some reason hasn't read The Grapes of Wrath, go back and read that, right? What about a couple other titles? Dick?
One that I give out as a gift often is the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. Beautiful, beautiful book that everyone should go back to, and the joy in life that it comes not from going around difficulties, but joy is a path that goes right through the middle of suffering.
I give out a lot of books, not just my own. And so it's hard to pick one, but a book that I really like and I give out is by my friend Stephen Mitchell, who did the translation to the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. And he's written a book called is it The Enchanted Heart, Sally, or something? And another one, The Enchanted Mind. It's a mind heart. Anyway, he takes readings, writings from various disciplines, and a lot of it spiritually oriented. And I think they're just great books. He's also done a lot of translations, and anyway, he's a wonderful writer. But generally, I just try to get people to pick a book and read it. You know, just pick a book, and rather than trying to recommend something. But can you all see why I feel so outclassed up here with? Jeez.
Not at all. All right, well, let's get to the real meaty questions now from the audience. So I don't have to take any responsibility, but these are some great questions. All right, this is for you, Neil. Who can reach the farmers that only think of growing fence to fence?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, and clearly they're been motivated primarily by economics, but they've also been, kind of fed that this is this almost mythic-like function that we're doing, right? That we used to talk about feeding the world. It was never true then, and now we talk about feeding and fueling the world, I guess, right? If you can justify burning 60% Iowa's corn crop in our gas tanks. But, and that's, as a lawyer, your head's shaped like a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and the nails are regulations. And I think the public has in fact let itself and the land down by not being willing to, in fact, use regulations that establish expected minimum standards of care. Everybody who drove here tonight had a car with seat belts, the doors are handicap accessible, we have sprinklers, right? There's not a component of American society that isn't touched and helped shape by regulation. But yet in Iowa, we have this mantra, oh, there's no role for regulation. Oh my God, we even codified it, right? As part of the nutrient reduction strategy, there will be no role for regulation. Well, it's magical thinking then if we think we're somehow going to have clean water or protected soil, if we're not willing to use the most powerful lever that society has in terms of trying to establish expected standards of care and conduct. So it's simple as that. Doesn't.
All right. Jim, this is for you. So, and I think they're asking about your cousin. I think it's your cousin who was involved with the KKK, I believe. So what did your cousin relate about white supremacy over the course of years, and how close were you? So what did your cousin relate about white supremacy?
It was my uncle who was a white supremacist.
Okay.
My cousin was the hero.
Okay, so but maybe answer both from the cousin's perspective and your uncle's perspective.
Well, I don't know what happened to my Uncle Everson. He came back from the war very, very bitter. So I went in to see him one time. I usually didn't see him at all, but my middle son developed epilepsy when he was younger. And somebody in the family said, your Uncle Everson had fits. And so you should see him. I went to see him and went in his little cafe that he owned. And it said for members only. And I said, I'm not a member, Uncle Everson. He looked at my hand. He said, that's white enough. You're a member. And that was all I needed to know about how far he had come. But he was just very, very bitter about African-American people. I have no idea why that is, because he didn't have much concourse. So he was, what he said was, you can't talk about it. The cousin, the hero of the story, just evolved after World War II. I think he just saw a lot of combat and realized that all life was precious, and back and really went through this. I'll tell you, he was so reviled by the white people. And yet after his death, the Mississippi legislature, they had an adjournment in honor of him, you know, and things like that. So ridiculous. But he taught me a lot about how to respond to white supremacy, white supremacists particularly. So that's all that I learned from those two guys. And it was a tragedy that Uncle Everson was so bitter because he led a lot of his fellows, this group of men who hung around his cafe. And I asked one time, I said, what is the African-American people doing that bothers you so? They get our jobs. I mean, if I'd thrown a rock there, I wouldn't have hit anybody looking for a job. Yeah. So anyway, that's enough of that.
Yeah. Okay, this one's for you, Dr. Deming. Do you think most cancer specialists feel as you do that healing the patient is possible even if curing is not? And just as a bonus, do you support universal health for the USA?
Yes, and I do support universal health. I mean, it doesn't make to make advances in cancer health. It doesn't help to come up with cures that's not readily available and not that people don't have access to. So it's utterly important. And the next answer I'm going to give is that I think 99% of individuals that go into medicine go into it for the right reason. But the way in which physicians are reimbursed over time skews the way that practice is done. So in the United States, we primarily have a fee for service, and the more you do, the more you make. And even though I would say it's subliminal that you want to succeed, you want to be good, you want to, how do you get measured? How do you compare? And it's how did I do? Did I get an A? Did I do more procedures than the next person? Did I generate more income than the next person? And when you have a system, for example, I'm a radiation oncologist. The more radiation treatments that I give someone, the more revenue comes to my practice and to me. The more expensive chemotherapy I give, the more revenue I will generate. The more surgeries I do, the more revenue I will generate. And subliminally, there's a conflict of interest that's never spoken of. So when I talk to someone who is newly diagnosed with prostate cancer, and I say, you have organ-confined prostate cancer that is not very aggressive, and we could do surgery, or we could do radiation, or we could do active surveillance. I probably spend 5 times longer talking about active surveillance that ends up yielding me and my healthcare system 1% of the revenue that would have been generated had I just given them the treatment they thought they wanted when they came in for. So the way in which we are reimbursed influences the care that the United States public receives. So we spend vastly more of our gross domestic product on healthcare than any other country, but yet we do not have better outcomes when it comes to health, life expectancy, infant mortality, maternal mortality. So we've got things in reverse, and part of that, it isn't because doctors are greedy or wanting to do the wrong thing. They're just doing what achieves the objectives that are kind of what we are judged on, what we are paid on. But I think that every physician is very much has their patient's interests at heart. Some folks are better communicators than others. And if you don't take time to sit and listen and be with someone in their pain and suffering, it does take time. So I think that the system for many doctors with as many patients as they need to see feel that, boy, if I just skip that part of my caring for patients, I can get through more patients and get through my day easier.
Yeah, well said. Neil, I think this question requires a different answer than your last one. This gets to more, I think, more motivation than regulation. They ask, if we believe Ken Burns, the event that spurred Congress to vote in favor of soil conservation was having the Dust Bowl cloud descend on Congress the day of the vote. What's the equivalent of that for today to move national leadership toward a land-based vision and hopefully ethic?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think that it bespeaks one of our problems is that we don't do a very good job of dealing with issues that we know are out there. And as they arise, it takes a crisis. It takes a Flint, Michigan with a water issue, right? At Toledo, it takes some type of major event. The first time the Des Moines Water Works isn't able to actually comply with the federal law that they meet, right? And we should be so thankful for the work they do every day. And the work they do every day helps keep the water quality issues kind of from being addressed, right? If they stopped and said, you know what, we're going to let the nitrate levels spike, and so you folks are going to have to go fish for a water supply, it'd change the dynamics of people saying, my God, we need to do something. And so I don't know if there's dust clouds going across, the windows, and that was Hugh Hammond Bennett, right, the father of soil conservation, that knew the dust cloud was approaching, and it's a wonderful story. And but I would hope that some people were kind of surprised 2 weeks ago where they saw local news of a dust cloud in northwest Iowa, right? The Hib-Bob that came out of South Dakota and across northwest Iowa, they had dust clouds that were reminiscent of the 1930s, right? And so the idea that, we have somehow handled soil conservation, not particularly, right? We are wonderful at addressing issues and kind of dealing with them halfway and then being distracted and finding something else new to distract ourselves. And unfortunately, I fear that our willingness to deal with climate change, right, that agriculture has all the potential in the world to turn it into one more dollar chase, right? We're going to be chasing dollars, whether it's building CO2 pipelines or selling carbon contracts, right? And as opposed to thinking about how it is that we could actually change our practices on the land and how we treat the land and actually deal with it more, right, systemically. The way we're going to deal with it is, well, Dad, whatever you do, don't make me stop growing corn or buying seeds or putting on fertilizer, right? And you hope that there isn't some type of major crisis that leads us to do things differently, but we never seem to take any lessons from anything. Certainly the lessons the drainage districts took from the Waterworks lawsuit wasn't that maybe they should think about dealing with water quality. It was, oh my God, we better start putting in more tile, right? And so they just put their foot on the gas a little bit harder on tile, and then still hold a resentment against Des Moines for somehow questioning that what they were doing to our water. So anyway,
Yeah. No, those are
I'll dismount.
Those are both thorough answers that demanding more systemic solutions, both in medicine and for the land. All right, I know we're getting close to time here, but this is a lighthearted question that's for all of you, for any of you. So whoever feels so moved first. What do you feel optimistic about when you consider the next 25 years in Iowa? Looking ahead the next quarter century, what fills you with some optimism?
Well, my next birthday, I'm going to be 90. I'm not looking ahead 25 years.
I would say the young generation. You see, as I get the opportunity to mentor pre-med students and medical students, the engagement that the young folks have with society, with social issues, with service is really inspirational. And so I am optimistic about the future of the state because of the brilliant young people that Iowa has.
Professor for a long time. I can't let Dick take the only thunder on being, appreciative of our students, right? And the young people that came through my classes. One specific development I find great pride in is the work of land trusts. I've been on the board of the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation now for 30 some years. And I think that you see an increasing number of Iowa landowners who recognize the unique features in their property, who are at a point in their lives where they're thinking about making the protections permanent. And there's a number of ways to do it. Two of the things that Con and I did with the farm that I inherited that gave us the most pride was, one, we donated a piece of my great-grandfather's farm to Adams County to create a prairie because Adams County needed a public prairie more than it needed another cornfield. And we sold the last piece of the family farm to a young neighbor so that he could get his start as a landowner, as a farmer. And, if we want new farmers, the people who are the landowners now need to get out of the way and make room. And I think that because we're such a land-based state, right, and so much of our wealth and our heritage and future is tied up in it, that people have the opportunity to be more thoughtful about what they do with it, right? And as said, relate in the book, right, our farm only continued to exist because in the 1950s, my grandmother gave my father half of the farm and his 5 siblings the other half, and required them to sell their pieces to him, right? Rather than treating them equally, she treated them fairly. And the fairness part was the fact that he'd come back from California and farmed with her for a decade. And so people, right, you can do whatever you want to with your land. You can sell it, you can protect it, right? It's not somehow predestined. And so I find great optimism in that. And that's that resilience, I think, that in fact can come from listening to the land.
It's wonderful. I think that photo of the young farmer is in your book too. Yeah, yeah.
He's handed me a check and I'm handing him a deed, yeah.
Here's another question for all of you. So you're all familiar with each other's work, which we've established this evening. And how might you describe a distinctly Iowa voice that surfaces in your work, a distinctly Iowa voice that might be common and threaded through your work? Maybe it wasn't easy to recognize. Maybe it's only striking you now as I ask the question. But what would be something that's kind of a uniquely Iowa feature to your work, would you think?
Well, Neil obviously has a distinctive Iowa voice, although his knowledge and his voice transcend Iowa. But I think there's that, and I don't think I do. But
what do you think? Is there anything that you've always considered to be distinct about your voice, about your writing voice? Just a characteristic that has, and maybe somebody else's reflected that to you, maybe made you realize that through the years?
people have said my writing is conversational. I don't know exactly what that means, but I take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
I don't know what else I would say about it.
I would think hopefulness is one of those things that we all share and our writings share.
You know, I was going to say the same thing. I think the ability to face adversity as just something to be expected. I think that the Midwestern sensibility of dealing with the elements and with adversity, it's and some of it, I was going to say generational, but some of it is geographic and weather. And I always think they talk about Iowa nice. I'm from South Dakota. I think what part of the Midwestern niceness is that if you're from South Dakota, you think if you're from someplace else, you're better than we are, unless you're from North Dakota. And it's not like we in South Dakota think we're better than North Dakotans, but we don't think they're better than us. But if you're from South Dakota, you think somebody from Iowa is got to be taller, smarter, better looking, and more sophisticated. So this sense of knowing we're of our place creates this sense of bearing hardship with hope and optimism.
I like that. That's good. All right, Dick, here's a very specific, tangible question, not easy, but somebody is asking, will cancer still be with us in 21, 22?
Yes, there is no cure for cancer. There is no, there's no way to cure or prevent every cancer. There's no way to prevent every cancer. Just as there is really no way to prevent aging. And if we ever did find a way to prevent aging, we're all in a heap of trouble. So the same thing that creates cancer is the same thing that allowed us to go from a one-cell organism to mammals to it's mutations. Mutations made some of us taller, smarter, and better looking, and mutations gave some of us cancer. And that process that leads to carcinogenesis, I don't think will ever be prevented, but we're making lots of progress in finding more cures for more cancers. And you know, now every time you turn around, there's another article on the use of immunotherapy stimulating your body's own immune system. Our body takes care of most cancers, most mutations that happen. Now we're finding ways of stimulating our immune system to take and make what was an incurable cancer, if not cured, controlled. You don't have to cure every cancer. You just have to keep it under control. And then you and your body can peacefully coexist.
Jim, here's another very specific, tangible question, also not easy though. Do you think Iowa public, well, maybe it is. Do you think Iowa public school teachers should be able to teach from your book? Do you think Iowa public school teachers should be able to teach from your book, they ask?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's wonderful. So one last question here, and then we'll wrap things up. So you represent a whole lot of Iowa winters on this stage. Well, sorry, Iowa winters, Iowa riders and winters. Sorry, my bad. You represent many winters, many riders. So what's the best untold Iowa story out there, just waiting to be told? What's the best untold story, maybe in your next book?
Kyle Munson's amazing talent as a moderator.
my
I don't think
mispronunciation.
enough of Americans know that.
Yeah, thanks.
Story that I didn't know anything about the other day. I was in Solon and I'm walking down the street and here's this big stone with a plaque on it. And it said that Lyman Dillon's furrow came through here in 1839. How many people here have ever heard of Dillon's furrow? In 1939, yeah, okay, that would be expected. In 1838, the government, federal government, said we need a military road that would connect Dubuque to Iowa City. And as part of the appropriation for that, this guy named Lyman Dillon from Cascade got a contract to plow a furrow from Iowa City to Dubuque. And then that furrow, and it's still pretty much Highway 1 and 151, right? That runs from Anamosa and up past Cascade and to Dubuque. And then the military road, the Dragoons Road, was laid out next to this furrow. And I said, hell, I never heard of that, right? And so I got online and there's a book. Some guy walked the trail and wrote a book about on the search for for Lyman Dillon. So the story's been told, but you know, we could hash it around some more because he didn't know whether or not, and it's still unclear whether he plowed it from Iowa City to Dubuque or Dubuque to Iowa City. And I'm thinking, well, that's the one that you should be able to figure out, I would think, but.
So Jim, can you top Dylan's furrow?
Oh, no, no, I cannot.
All right. Well, that's perfect. All right. Well, thanks to everybody. All right. Let me tell you about the rest of the evening here. The book signing line is going to be outside, so make sure you stick around, talk to these gentlemen, buy their books from Beaverdale Books, and have them signed. This is the last AViD for the year, but the library has local and Iowa author events that are going to be happening, throughout the rest of 2022. One to look forward to, we have Beth Hoffman, who's the author, of course, of Bet the Farm, the Dollars and Cents of Growing Food in America. That'll be July 21st here at the library. So I just want to thank the library and the Library Foundation for a wonderful evening, for a wonderful AViD series. Could we give another hand to Dory Briles too, and congratulate Dory. Yes, that's right. And thanks to this wonderful trio one more time. Thanks for coming out.